So Michael Fisch is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. He is the author of An Anthropology of the Machine, Tokyo's Commuter Train Network, which is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press in 2018. His research is situated at the intersection of sociocultural anthropology and science and technology studies, and is focused on the human relationship with technology, paying particular attention to the body within structures of technological mediation, something that I'm also very, very interested in. His current work is concerned with the dynamic between changing conceptualizations of nature, culture, and technological innovation, and the title of his talk is Automated Agriculture for a Post-Disaster World. Michael.
I'm going to read parts of this, but I'm also going to talk at other parts. This is very much a work in progress, or parts of work in progress. Research that I can't see anything from here. I can see like dim silhouettes of bodies. Anyways, so this is very much work in progress from material that I collected over the last year in Japan. And so I'm really at this stage where I'm just putting things together and trying to figure out what they mean. So sort of it's topically probably a little bit more dense than analytically rigorous at this point. Hopefully that I can get some feedback from people to think about these things. I'm going to talk about automated agriculture in post-disaster environments, as the topic says. But I also first want to give a little background for the environment in which I'm thinking about these things, because that's important. So some of the stuff is going to be things that you've seen before. And for the contextual history, I'll probably read a little bit. So as a number of recent critical works have argued, nothing says opportunity quite like a full-scale disaster. Of course, this has been true for some time. It has been an unescapable and unveiled truth, however, in recent years, as we've witnessed the ramming through of massive pro-corporate political, economic, and social reforms in the aftermath of countless disasters, whether technological, financial, and social. The triple disaster in 2011 in northeast Japan, in which a large earthquake off the coast triggered a massive tsunami and subsequent meltdown at a nuclear power plant, is only one of the many recent examples one could offer here. And here I'll just put this on, but it's going to be okay. So you'll be able to. This is without sound because otherwise it's too disturbing. You can just watch this as you are. With the height of the wave reaching 38 meters, that's 124 feet, which is really high at points, the tsunami cleared away everything in its path, which for a large part meant wiping out neighborhoods and infrastructure that had been built on coastal landfills and marshlands during the rush to develop the nation's economy in the early decades following World War II. At that time, post-war Japan, with the threat of Imperial Japan apparently subdued, and the new threat, according to the world the emerging Cold War worldview, was material consumerism, which American and Japanese leaders feared would open the hearts and minds of people to communist influences. To forestall the so-called red threat, local governments, with the backing of central government in Tokyo, enticed industry with the promise of cheap land and cheap labor to build its factories on the northeast coast. Within a short time, those factories spawned coastal neighborhoods that grew at a frenzied pace, enjoying access to the ocean, which would eventually turn deadly. So just to give you a sense, this is what some of the area looked like prior to the development. I think you see dates are 1960 and 1959. This is the Ishinomaki area. And it was basically marshlands and sand and whatnot. Here's a better scene that you can get. And these are slides that I was given from a researcher. So this is his stuff, not mine. You can see basically the part that I'm going to talk about is where you see the characters written over the land there. It's all basically clear. You can see there's nothing there. And this is from around 1947, just after the war ended. And then by the early 1950s, they're starting to build up. And then by late 1960s, it starts to look like this, 1970s, and this is 2011, just before the disaster. And this is what it looks like after the disaster. So basically everything was kind of just wiped out. How fast everything vanished was actually quite amazing. I mean, it's just a matter of hours. As a friend and fellow researcher from the area who witnessed the event and its aftermath put it, infrastructures in neighborhoods that had taken years to build were suddenly gone within a matter of hours. Just as surprising, though, was how quickly the wetlands reclaimed the coast. So this is what the area looked like very soon after the tsunami. In the summer, you can see a lot of these, what are squares, were foundations for buildings or factories and places like this. And it's an interesting place because it's a meeting zone of three different kinds of waters. You have the water from the sea, you have rainwater, and you have local water that allows a really interesting ecology to develop that, a very dynamic one. Once the debris was cleared away, it was as if the landscape had managed to regenerate almost immediately. Despite the years of abuse, with the concrete lifted in many places, neighborhoods and factories cleared away, the marshland returned, and with it insects, fowl, minnows, crabs, tiny shrimp, making their home amidst the ruins. And so this is an example of insects and things that started to come back rather quickly, and ducks and all sorts of nice things. The displaced before. But such pesky persistence of resilient life without clear economic value, however, was not about to stop the Japanese government and local prefectures. Since 2012, the government has pursued a massive reconstruction project. Much to the dismay of many of the local residents, the reconstruction project is turning out to be nothing more than a repetition of Japan's post-war economic recovery program, focusing again on the building of industry. Worse, the current reconstruction is more than just repetition. It's post-war economic recovery program. It's the post-war economic recovery program on steroids. And nothing says this more clearly, I think, than the project to build 370 kilometers of massive seawalls up the coast. That's basically going to destroy all this ecology. This was one of the main focuses of my project, but what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a side aspect of that. But still, it's important to talk about the seawalls for the moment because they are very much, as I'll make clear, that which enables a certain kind of thinking about automation. Seawalls were a vital part of the post-war construction of factories and neighborhoods on marshlands on the coast, creating a barrier to prevent the mingling of sea and land. The seawalls allowed for a drying up of marshlands while supposedly guaranteeing the corporations that their factory assets would not be regularly swamped by seawater from seasonal typhoons and the occasional tsunami. With few exceptions, seawalls built in the decades after the war tended to be between 3 to 7 meters high. There were places where it was 10 or more, but very few. All of those structures were breached and mostly destroyed in the tsunami of March 2011. The new seawall construction, by contrast to this old seawall, is producing or has already produced, more to the case, walls that range anything between 7 to 15 meters high. And what that actually looks like, if you think about that, it's pretty massive. So, and the walls and the base is, in many places, it's 80 meters long and 14.7 meters high, which is basically, it looks something like this when you stand in front of it. I mean, that behind me is the sea, which is actually really beautiful, but you'll never know that. And you'll never see it again until these things. So will the new seawalls offer protection from the next major tsunami? Probably not. As many of the people from the area suggest, seawalls are gray infrastructure from a bygone industrial paradigm and a vision of nature. Such gray cement infrastructure, they say, is dumb infrastructure, lacking any kind of cybernetic feedback apparatus that might transform it into something more dynamic and interactive with its surrounding. But dumb gray infrastructure tends to provide the gateway for so-called smart infrastructure systems, and Northeast Japan is no exception to this rule. While the Japanese government and industry are pursuing reconstruction as repetition of a post-war recovery program, others view the cleared landscape of the Northeast as a rich tabula rasa onto which to inscribe a technological reality adequate to the dreams of the 21st century. At the forefront of, is there water up here? Yeah, thanks. At the forefront of groups eager to transform the post-disaster landscape into an automated environment is Tokyo University's Food Production Technology and Research Center. There are a number of automated environment projects that the center is pushing. One of them is what's called a plant factory, and this is going to be basically agriculture is going to be moved indoors. And one of the reasons for this is there is the anticipation of future disasters, but also anticipation of radiation leakage and basically pollution. So by moving these things indoors and basically putting them within hermetically sealed environments from everything from water, there's no soil, it's all hydroponics and chemicals. They will be able to mitigate all those outdoor effects and create these sealed indoor environments. The project, I visited a couple of these places. It's pretty impressive. I mean, it's all robot planted, robot picked, robot maintained. It's all LED lights. They don't rely on anything from the outside. Even the water is recirculated. The biggest problem, it turns out, is that the plants have no taste. It turns out that plants need stress. So these plants have too much of a stress-free life. So maybe that's a lesson to us all. I don't know. Stress breeds taste. Makes taste. So it's interesting to see. But they're trying to think about how they can stress their plants out a little bit, but not too much. So another option that they're thinking about is to do meat factories, so they won't have to rely on cattle and things like such, nasty animals like that. So they want to actually just do everything from they want to produce all the meat indoors in these factories, artificial meats. And this is nothing new. This is stuff that's been done in other parts of the world, but they're trying to ramp up the idea here and make it actually economically feasible. They claim that this tastes exactly like meat. You never know the difference. I didn't get a chance to taste it. I wasn't eager to, but we'll see how things go, what our future looks like. So again, the logic behind these factories is precisely the anticipation of climate catastrophe, whether by extreme weather pollution, nuclear disaster, or some combination of all of the above. But what I want to look at here, though, is a project to transform large sections of the Northeast into fully automated pecan orchards. And I call this the Pecan Project because that's what they call it. On the most basic level, and this is there's no Pecan Project there yet. It's all at the research and startup phase, so there's no place to do research. So I had to take pictures from the web to kind of give you a sense of what this is. Thank you so much. Basically, they want to mobilize drones, satellites, robots, and sensors together with this massive computer apparatus to grow pecan orchards in North Japan. More specifically, the robots will be responsible for planting and maintaining the harvest, while the terrain sensors, drones outfitted with infrared heat sensors, and satellites will provide real-time data on soil, water, and wind condition, as well as the health of the trees. The drones will also provide a second task, which is to attack and chase away any birds and other creatures. So there'll be some surveillance attack drones. So don't go near the orchards. And while each orchard will be privately owned, all the orchards will operate together as a large assemblage overseen by a central corporation that will own and manage all the data generated by the constant flow of real-time surveillance through drones and the satellites. So the individual owners will have very little to do with their orchards. At the moment, the Pecan Project is in a startup phase, as I said, developing technology while seeking financial backers. So there's not much of a site, as I said, to go through it. But just to give you a sense of the assemblage that came together to create this Pecan Project, it's quite impressive. First of all, it starts from North Bowie Farming in Arizona in the United States. And then it's the New Mexico University for Department of Agricultural Services, together with the United States Department of Agricultural Research Services, together with Tokyo University's School of Agricultural Life Sciences, and then Tokyo University Food Production Technologies Research Center. And then you have Aeroscene, which is a company that's it's formed by Sony on one part and a company called ZMP, which is a company that says the slogan is robot of everything, and it focuses on the autonomous humanoid robots and robot cars for the future. And finally, you have the finance that comes from NIDO, which is currently comes from NIDO, but it's not where it initially came from, which is the New Energy and Technology Development Organization finance system. So, how is this assemblage of companies, of corporate agencies from all over the world? How did it come about? As usual, it's a complicated but somewhat haphazard story. So it started with the Japanese Ministry for Technological and Industrial Development decided to seed money of $5 million to Tokyo University's Industrial Science Center, which was going to get the money and then invested in Tokyo. At the time, this man, Dr. Maeda, was going to be the dean or the president of Tokyo University, and he wanted to then use the $5 million in a way that would be innovative to fulfill his task. And so he had a friend, Mr. Mitani, who was in New York, who worked for Goldman Sachs, but was retiring and had invested money in North Bowie, right? So these guys thought, hey, great opportunity, let's put the money to work. So they put the money to work and they built this thing, they brought this assemblage together, and that's how it was born. Okay, so of course this raises a lot of questions. It raises questions of why pecans and why Northeast Japan. Naturally, it all centers around capital, as I said, but more specifically, nuts are currently the most profitable agriculture in the United States. In fact, second only to marijuana. So it's probably easier to sell it. But the majority of nuts grown in the United States are being sold to China. And pecans in particular have taken off in the Chinese market because they are supposed to suppress Alzheimer's and diabetes. So they're particularly good for an aging society. So pecans are good money. That's the one way to go to do it. So why Japan? Well, the argument goes, or the narrative goes, that due to urbanization and the aging society trend in Japan, which is especially affecting rural areas, there's been a large increase in the number of abandoned rice paddies. So, but rice is supposedly not a profitable crop anymore. It's too labor intensive, even with certain levels of automation. It demands more labor, in fact, from the population, especially because it's an aging population and a dwindling population. Therefore, they can no longer support rice farming. Rice also tends to be grown on individual plots and hugely supplemented by government subsidies. So it's not economically as generous as something like pecans. Also, the tsunami, more importantly, opened up huge amounts of land, creating large swaths of terrain that are ripe for orchards as it is. But the biggest problem and the cost for orchards in the United States is water, which supposedly Japan has abundance of, so especially in that area. Of course, there is one, or at least one big problem, which is pecans don't currently grow in Japan and never have grown in Japan. So that's a huge problem, right? But of course, technology can solve that. This problem, as it were, elicits a provisional resolution of conflict in the form of another smart environment for smart environment systems for genomic selection. Genomic selection is being headed by this guy from the University of Tokyo, Iwata-san. And genomic selection is not bioengineering. It does not seek to directly manipulate the DNA of the organism. Rather, it tries to intervene in the evolutionary process and to grow entities that will have a better chance of survival in their certain environments. But the problem is that it takes a long time. So you get a plant, you recognize some certain traits in it, and then you breed it with another plant, and then you let it grow, and then it can take years and years and years until you finally get the plant that you want that can survive the impending climate disaster or whatnot. And obviously we don't have time, right? We've got to grow this stuff faster if we want to survive. So this guy's figured out a way to speed up the whole process through predictive algorithms that are able to grow a plant, identify certain features of what the plant is, for certain features that they want in seeds, and then run that through a series of algorithms and series of modeling that will then predict the evolutionary phases of the plant and allow you to then move ahead and pick or combine different seeds to get the outcomes that you want. So it speeds up the evolution process by 20 to 30 years, so which is a lot for plants, considering that they don't. This is just examples from his research lab. And the thing is, again, it basically uses all the technology that they're using for the Pecan. It uses drones, satellites, sensors, and computer systems. So it's just an adaptation of the technology for the pecans onto the stuff for the drones. One of the interesting things I thought about it was that it uses its model here is what's called MBD, or model-based design. This is the definition of that, is a mathematical and visual method of addressing problems associated with designing complex control, signaling, processing, and communication systems. It uses motion control, industrial equipment, aerospace, and automotive applications. So MBD design is used for developing cars to operate in all environments. And basically, they're taking the same paradigm, the same sort of operational schema, and applying it to plants in order to develop a plant that can, start in cold weather. That won't get, it can do the same thing that your car does in cold weather. So the idea is to copy the sort of the evolutionary paradigm of technology onto the evolutionary paradigm of organic plants and whatnot. All right. So thinking about the Pecan Project, and how does the Pecan Project ask us to think about automated environments? How and with whom can we think about the kinds of automated environments that it elicits, and what questions, concerns, and problematics are raised therein? This is sort of the attempt to develop a kind of analytical approach here. The triple disaster of March 2011 constitutes the condition of possibility for the Pecan Project. And those disasters are in many ways what made the project thinkable. In the simplest sense, the land cleared by the tsunami offered the initial moment in that thinking, eliciting the idea for something other than what had been there before to come occupy it. The cleared away land seemed to provide a certain affordance, as it were. What is then interesting in part is the way in which that affordance calls forth the heterogeneous components of the assemblage, beginning with the mobilization of capital from across the sea. But there's also the question of what kind of work the automation is doing in this project. As stated earlier, the need for automation is justified through demographics, specifically the claim that the population diminishing and the labor-intensive traditional crops like rice farming are unsustainable in the long run uneconomical. But the specific rationale for pecans has less to do with concerns for changing conditions of labor than it does for the current anticipated market or the future market for the product. Interestingly, it is precisely on this question of labor and the relationship to the local community that the project has faltered. As a number of the researchers and people involved in the project suggested, the technology for the Pecan Project mostly exists already. They could do it. What is stopping them however, resistance from local communities and individuals who are unwilling to let go of their land despite not currently using the land. And it's complicated because the land, as I said, is small plots and they're individually owned, so they can't get enough of a coherent piece of land in order to grow a pecan orchard. The landowners tend to view the project with tremendous suspicion. Now, the suspicion is seen among the members of the Pecan Project, the tech people, as exemplary of a kind of rigid closed-mindedness and lack of imagination that plagues Japan's aging population and keeps them locked into 20th century economic paradigms. Total agricultural automation is the future, they say. Interestingly, the economics of that future relies on an expanding aging society, since we can't forget that the pecans are for older people. In short, the Pecan Project pays little if no attention to the specific qualities of the social environment in the Northeast. In the same way, it pays little attention to the actual ecological relations there. The automated agriculture environment that it proposes can be thought of rather as an attempt to reprogram areas of the Northeast as closed feedback environments. In this sense, the project could be almost anywhere in the world. It doesn't really matter. The recent disasters in Japan and the water just made it convenient now to begin the project there. The notion of reprogramming here recalls the recent work, Program Earth, in which Jennifer Gabrys explores the way in which an emerging interlocking assemblage of sensor technologies are creating new environments for programming the Earth in distinct ways. Rogabri suggests that programming of the Earth as working toward a novel articulation of concrescence, and she's theorizing this in terms of Whitehead and Simondon. I see something different happening here. Concrescence in this regard, at least the way that Whitehead and Simondon talk about it, involves the establishment of a novel articulation of a functional coherency between processes that is not merely efficient but ethical in its opening toward future relational correspondence of emergent flourishings. And this obviously doesn't open up towards those future relationships. It basically closes them down and creates these sort of these closed lock-key systems within these spaces on these lands that don't do anything but for the lands except for generate forms of capital for places for other ways. So basically it's a continuation of a similar of a paradigm that we've seen throughout the 20th century, but just enclosing it, automating it, and completely locking out the social, which has been a sort of the traditional sites locking out labor, which has been a traditional site of the social. This brings forth all these questions about that we could go into about design and redesign, the attempts to design certain ecologies and remediate ecologies in certain ways by redesigning them for anticipatory futures. At the same time, the dreams that this encapsulates of providing this fresh tabula rasa on which to write these new technological futures that will somehow bring forth not so much a different social world, but a different world of markets, or at least a more lucrative system for the future. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.